Welcome, persisters. It's Elizabeth, of course, and I am very excited to have Victoria Pelletier today as our PersistenceU guest. Victoria is a keynote speaker. She was a COO for a company at the age of 24, contributing author to a book called Unstoppable. Victoria had a life of some really pretty serious abuse and spent some time, I think, in foster care and was adopted. So she certainly had her share of obstacles, but has not let them get in her way. And so I'm really looking forward to chatting with her. Just a quick update, and I don't know when this will post. It's April 10th, 2023, as I record this note. A couple of exciting things. One is I have been recording the audiobook version of Grounded in Grit, Turn Your Challenges into Superpowers, and Finding More Mistakes. Even though I pay editors, I add mistakes as time goes on. When I make the switch, I edit something out, I accidentally add something in. So this is an excellent way to find one's mistakes if they are a writer, is by reading their work out loud. Painful, but it is still kind of fun, just kind of, not always. In more news, I wanted to give a huge shout out to the Tennessee Fitness Spa, Nancy Shaw, Carol Krine, also Rachel, whose last name is now escaping me, at the Tennessee Fitness Spa. Huge thank you, because I had the most wonderful, refreshing time for a few days teaching workshops on memoir and on book to movie, but also just having time to listen to the sounds of nature. It was miraculous. I came back refreshed and ready to move, and renovating some of the public speaking talk points I've been doing. It just was inspiring. I'm working with a dear woman that I met in a group that I took a class with. I'm working with Brenda Welburn, and she was a podcast guest at PersistenceU in recent history. Look her up because she was amazing. And she and I are going to embark on some joint speaking adventures. I meant to say venture, but Freudian slip, I said adventure. But anyway, we both are such women from such different pasts and we grew up in different communities. One would think we'd have so little in common, but the conversations we want to have are with women and just helping us remember what is it that we can agree on, and why is it important that we don't get so incredibly divided. So right now we're titling our presentations. They will be on things like safety in the home, developing powerful friendships or weeding out ones that are toxic, knowing our history, those sorts of things, but from very different perspectives, and yet a wonderful dialogue. All of us are looking at the world based on the lens we don't even think we're looking through sometimes, the lens of our childhood, of our families, beliefs and histories, of the areas that we grew up in. And sometimes we forget that we don't have to just stay with that small lens. We can kind of defog a little bit and expand our thinking and see why other people think the way that they do. So I'm really looking forward to working with Brenda Welburn. Now, I always promised myself quietly as an author that when my tiny little book that became a movie received 1,000 reviews, I would celebrate with you on social media. Like, that would be such a benchmark. I didn't expect it might ever happen. I think if an author gets anything more than 30 online customer reviews, they feel very, very lucky. But my goal was hopefully in my lifetime 1,000. So I was getting close to it right before I went to Tennessee Fitness Spa. And I was checking out my online reviews, or sometimes they're not called reviews, but what is it called when you get like just the stars, but not a review? I was checking it out to make sure that on the day that I got 1,000, that I would do like a video or some sort of fun celebration, maybe take myself to dinner. And then Amazon has this funny thing going on now where they just suddenly this is not just for me, it's for other authors, where they suddenly updated their reviews. And it turns out I have like almost 3,000 it's not because I did something wonderful. My book didn't suddenly start selling better. It's just that they were behind and reconfigured how they show their customer reviews. And so, dang it, I missed it, but that's a good problem to have. So I'm really excited about that. Yippee. So if you'd like to do a happy dance with me, please do. I am so grateful for every one of you who's read the book, also who's taken the time to give your impression, your honest feedback. It just means the world to every author that you take the time and you do that. It does not directly sell books, but it does ultimately impact sales. So anyway, that's some fun things. Going to start soon with Victoria. I hope that you feel comfortable writing me when you need to. If you have an idea for a podcast, remember this podcast is all about persistence, and it's made by and for survivors and strivers. And so I stay in theme. The best way for somebody to query me or to, let me know they're interested in being on the podcast is to reach out through my website, lameredith.com, and or be on Podmatch and reach out that way. But they need to have listened to some episodes first and make sure that their theme fits in there. Not every person is for every podcast. So anyway, it's fun to see who you like and who you would recommend, but I would just encourage anyone who's interested in querying to go ahead and do so. And to know if you haven't heard back from me, it's not because you aren't amazing. It's because either it wasn't a fit and I'm behind in my work, or that I didn't get to it yet. Sometimes it takes months for me to get to it because I'm a one-woman operation at the moment. Thanks for being here. As ever, you being here means the world. Sharing it with a friend, even better. Join me on patreon.com if you feel like supporting the podcast a little closely and want some extra content and time with me. Thanks. And here we go with Victoria. Victoria Pelletier, it is so great to have you. And how did I do with your last name?
Very well. Thank
you. Victoria and I were just talking a second ago about how I try so hard that I tend to botch names after I try too hard. So I'm so excited. I'm really thankful you're with me today on PersistenceU. And I'm fascinated by your story. You grew up in Canada, and I alluded to in your introduction some of the kind of bumpy roads that you had. But could you tell us a little bit about how did the things that you experienced as a child kind of set you up for success in a weird way to be the business dynamo that you are today?
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and pleased to be able to share my story. And I describe when I started talking about my lived experience and being like very vulnerable and open about it, which was probably a little over 10 years ago, maybe one-on-one settings before that. It was because I realized I had to share it so people could understand my drive, my why. If you like Simon Sinek's viral, like start with why. And so that's why I started sharing it, to make other people recognize that we all face adversity, some of us trauma as part of that, and how we choose to move forward, can define where we go in our lives. And so for me, mine started very, very early on, the adversity and trauma I experienced. I was born to a drug addicted teenage mother who was exceptionally abusive to me. And so I went in and out of the child welfare system and given to friends after an episode, and quite abusive. I mean, pushed upstairs, downstairs, dislocated shoulders at like 18 months, 2 years old. I had a cigarette in my eye. I wore a patch for months. And the family that ended up adopting me, my mom actually, my mom being the woman that adopted me and raised me, met Julie, my biological mother, in a bar because my mom used to write for Music Magazine. And so really, like, Julie called her one day though. And so the last words I remember her stating while I lived in her care were, "Come and get her before I kill her." And
come and get her before I kill her. That was your exit from your mother. I am so sorry.
And so I, left with a, few clothes in my bag. She didn't even let me keep, I had nothing. I slept on a mattress on the floor. Like there was not a lot in that home. But she forced me to leave behind my teddy bear, like the only toy I think I had. And so although the most selfless thing she could have done is when my mom said to her, we'd like to take her away. We'd like to adopt her. And she agreed. And so that is very much a big part of my why. I think, fight or flight, I'm a fighter. Although I was hardened, I will tell you, like I was like extremely tough kid. I think I've always sort of, and I can share it later, but like I had these walls up, like I was not going to let someone hurt me. Also, I might push people away before they could reject or hurt me. Because I remember my mom oftentimes saying like, Tori, like, we're not going to give you away. But it was just one element for me. Like it wasn't kind of all sunshine from there, no abuse. And, my mom in particular, exceptionally loving, but socioeconomically, very little money in that household. No food insecurity, always had clothes on the table, but there was no vacations, there was no school trips, there was not much else. So, and that's sort of began my journey at working at age 11. And I felt that was a place that I was deeply in control of what I learned, the skills in the business, my work ethic, and how I showed up. I could, control that. And that was, very much recognized and led me to not only buy the things that I wanted, but also I started to see like that I would started to be viewed, as being successful for a lot of what I delivered from a work perspective. And so that's a lot of my why, and there's been lots more upon the journey, but that's kind of what's innately, caused me to, in my mind, I was determined to be better than my biology or my circumstances.
That's amazing. And I mean, it may sound awful to people who were biologically related to you, but you could do one thing or another. You could follow the footsteps, or you could say, nope, I think I deserve better than this, and forge a path. And I think a lot of times people who haven't grown up with abuse think they feel empathetic, maybe sympathetic toward those of us who have, and think we must be the nicest, most bravest people in the world, and are horrified to find out that we have real sharp edges because, because you don't get real soft with going through all those things and surviving, right?
Right.
But you can leverage it to an advantage in that way. And I'm so impressed that you did that. I mean, these skills, like what were some of the skills you relied on that helped propel you to the place you are now? And then let's talk about how that path went.
Yeah, a few. I do believe there's an element of this kind of resilience that I've developed that's innate or in my DNA somehow. But also I think, I remember at the time hating, my mother would sit me down and she'd be like, Tori, like we need to talk about like why you reacted in this way, or why you did this and got in trouble for something, or even in honestly my early relationships. Like I got involved. I grew quite quickly. Like by, age 10, I was taller than my teacher, like a fairly mature. And I recognized I got a lot of attention as a result of that. And it felt good to be liked and desired. And that put me in some really poor situations. Right. And so my mom would sit me down and she's like, let's talk through this. And so she would get me to analyze and talk about my feelings, but really and understand why that was driving me to make some poor choices. And I hated it as a teenager. But I do attribute her ability to get me to be incredibly self-aware and reflective, and then try to model different kind of thinking and action as a big part of what I talk about as having a healthy level of resilience. Because before it was like walls up, I'm going to push you away before you can hurt me. And then, to learning to break those down over time, and also learning to have very different choices, because many, people will not have experienced the like trauma, that an abuse maybe that you and I did, but we all deal with obstacles and challenge. And right. So I believe it is, I'll say, feel the emotion. Like I'm all marshmallow inside. I'm going to have an emotion, whether it's actually anger or sadness. Like I'm going to have the emotion quickly, but then I have the ability to make a choice in terms of how I'm then going to move forward. And a lot of that comes from some of those early years and self-reflection and starting to try and model a different way of thinking and speaking and acting.
I love that your mother was somebody who helped you stop and think. That's really incredible that you listened to a certain extent, even if you didn't want to, and, really helped you slow down, because you could have gone a totally different direction, especially by developing and getting tall really early on. People treat you like an adult when you're not an adult, when you're a taller kid, a bigger kid. So That's wonderful. When did you start knowing that you had, some of these things that others might have considered to be hardships or deficits in some way in life became your superpower? When did you start realizing like, oh, I got some strengths here from some of these experiences and weathering it?
I don't actually think I realized it, till a lot later. And it was almost the fact that there were many others. So my maturity and how quickly I grew in all areas, like I was raped at 14.
Oh,
And some of that was me wanting to get attention. Not my fault. Don't get me wrong. There's no victim blaming here. I just recognize I put myself in some, precarious situations, in part because I wanted to feel good and feel accepted and loved, but in other part, because I was just so physically developed. So it was that to like then an abusive like boyfriend, at 19, I think. And even along the road, like my first marriage, when I was pregnant with our second child, found out I was married to a woman, and she had cancer 7 weeks into my pregnancy with our youngest one. And so going through, like, I drove us home from my hospital delivery because she had chemotherapy the same day, right? Like, so just to even in the corporate setting, like 18 mergers and acquisitions, which come with lots of like reorganization and tough decisions. It's a series of all of these things. So I wouldn't say like I knew it, but at some point, I feel like in my 30s, actually, I continue to be incredibly resilient. My best friend nicknamed me Turtle, really tough exterior. The marshmallow inside is the softy turtle part. And I was just like, and people started to ask me more and more as I was like coaching, and it not at the personal level, but like just how, even from a business perspective. And it was at that point, like being again, really like self-aware and reflective. I had to go, you know what, I am like super resilient. And I think it comes back to childhood, but learning how to process and deal with things, because I used to compartmentalize and like I wouldn't necessarily deal with it all. And so then learning how to do a little bit more of that. That's what like when I recognize that all of this pain and like adversity and challenge I've had is actually what has propelled me and allowed me to be really successful in different settings, and particularly even in a business context.
That is so fantastic. I think as a child, and my professional life used to have me in contact with a lot of children who were abused, but you can become so good at forecasting your parents' moods or the family dynamic to survive when you're little, before you were adopted, that some of those skills kind of help you read a room like no one else could imagine. Right?
Very much so.
And that is not everyone's skill set. And good for you for taking that and making a moneymaker out of it. Now, I mentioned that you were a COO of a business at 24, I believe it is. Could you tell us a little bit about your path to success?
Yeah, so I remember my mom saying to me when I was 11, she's like, Tori, you need to do better than us. And for her, that meant socioeconomically. She wanted me to, get a good education, and go into, a vocation that was different than theirs. My dad was a school janitor and my mom a secretary. And for me, I was determined to be better than biology or circumstance. So I thought I was going to be a lawyer, actually. That's what I wanted. Jokingly, I say, I think she had me watching LA Law too much with her back then. That will age me for sure, because most people are like, what is that? And so that was the path. But when I was in university, I was working for a bank, and I've been a voracious learner. And as I said earlier, I realized in the work world, I could control the skills I learned, and my work ethic and how I performed. And so for me, I took the opportunity to learn everything that the bank at the time offered me. I was leading in their contact center. I got promoted within 6 months into like a leadership role. And I went from various different areas across the banking organization, running large contact centers for them, so that when I got recruited into be that chief operating officer for an outsourcing organization, that was a massive stretch role for me, because I'd been running operations in a bank, and by operations, primarily contact center. I had multiple of the criteria they wanted: large contact center operations in financial services. And I show up, even if I don't always feel that way. Fake it till you make it. I don't believe in that, except for pretending to be really confident, even in moments you're not. And so I've always kind of showed up in that way. And so they hired me because I had learned a lot. And by that, time I'd been working for, in the banking world for 6 years and like risen, to like director level. And so for me, I leaned into discomfort because I knew there were things I didn't know. In that role, almost every business function in that organization reported to me except finance. So like technology and HR and sales and marketing and things that I didn't own in my prior roles. But I also had to lean into what I knew as a leader. I became my first leadership role was 14, and I was the assistant manager in a shoe store I worked at.
Wow.
So I just needed all the years I'd had at 10 years at that point in like leadership roles in different environments, like leaning into that, meaning learn how to have the right team around me with skills that I didn't have, right? And so that we could complement one another and learn how to build a really great environment and culture so people wanted to be there. The world of outsourcing is not generally a destination for people. You think of and at the time it was like telemarketing, which is not a fun job, and some customer service and some technical support. So you're getting lots of immigrants into the country or people between jobs. So I wanted to create a really good environment for people to stay as long as possible and be as productive as possible for the time that I had them. And so it was like just leaning into the little, I'll say little, but I still had many years of experience at that point, and confidence in the skills I did bring to the table and learning to complement with like a diverse team around me.
Right. Fantastic. I do believe, and I had a guest recently who kind of reinforced this. I think sometimes our early childhood experiences of not feeling safe or included or valued really makes some of us passionate as adults that everyone should find a place at the table and be celebrated. And it sounds like you worked on doing exactly that really early on.
Yeah. I did. And so from it initially stemmed a little bit out of my personal experience. When I stepped into that role, it had never been so like starkly obvious around like that there was huge disparity. So I'd often been the youngest, having been promoted in leadership roles early, but there'd been many women around in the banking environment I was in. I stepped into that role. I was the youngest by at least 2 decades. I was the only woman and a member of the LGBT community. So I came out in my teens as being bisexual, but I was dating and later married a woman. And so I stepped in that role and I'm like, well, I need to do better as the leader here so others don't feel like they're the only person. Right. Whatever, when you think about diversity, there's all this intersectionality of what does that mean? And still recognizing we're privileged. I'm a white woman born in North America. I still have a ton of privilege. Right. But again, going back to that environment where in an outsourcing environment, knowing I don't have people like, again, it's not their destination job. And many of them were new immigrants to the country. And so to create an environment where people wanted to perform in a job that always wasn't fun. Like I said, telemarketing, and this was long before the days of like do not call lists and things like that. And like, doing visa activation calls and like, it's either boring work or really tough work. And so I wanted to create a place where people had fun coming into work. And a big part of that, creating that environment, means they feel a sense of belonging. They can show up, they can talk about their weekends and what they did in very different backgrounds that, they're doing that. And so that was sort of my foray. And this is 23 years ago into the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, before we had like kind of these formalized employee resource groups. And it was one, recognizing it. I didn't want people to feel like me, the only, and two, create an environment that people wanted to be in that ultimately created better performance for the business. So this is where I often tell people, like, it's not just the right thing to do. It's really great for business to be focused on these kind of diversity initiatives.
I think that's fantastic. Financially, it makes sense. Morally and otherwise, it makes sense. And it makes sense in a lot of ways, like CENTS sense, and it makes common sense, makes sense in 2 different ways. But yes, absolutely. And that's fantastic. So now you became a part of this wonderful book. You're part of an anthology. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a good friend of mine. She had actually been part of this publisher, often does these kind of co-authored books, and she'd done it, had a great experience, and she got me connected with a publisher who said that their next book was going to be entitled Unstoppable, and about change makers who dare to make a difference. And unstoppable is like my mantra and philosophy. And when I sign off on my social media posts, it's hashtag unstoppable, hashtag no excuses, and then whatever else is appropriate for that post. And so I'm like, okay, this is me.
Right.
And that was the first time I shared in writing the story that I'm now sharing with you.
Okay.
So my chapter, and actually the publishers ended up making me the first chapter, the opening for the book.
How
It's called
exciting.
Courage to Live. And I shared a little bit more around what were some of the lessons I learned
Right.
through that journey. And it's actually what then got me comfortable standing on larger stages as a public speaker, telling the story. I might have shared it one-on-one as I was coaching or in smaller groups. But I'm like, you know what, go big or go home. And that was a big help for me.
You ripped off the Band-Aid and came clean. It sounds like you really did it.
That's right.
So that's fantastic. And so you do a lot of speaking and things today, correct?
I do. I've actually been speaking for over 20 years, but the first 10 of which were almost exclusively from a corporate standpoint, at conferences where we were sponsoring events or to go and speak on a topic that I was, fairly knowledgeable in. And so I've gained confidence standing on stages. I made the shift 10 years ago to become a professional speaker, paid speaker, in addition to sort of my corporate job. And that's still a lot of intersectionality. I do tell my personal story, but I also tell the lessons I've learned out of it and how I've applied it in the corporate world. And then I also talk about things that I live and breathe in terms of like my passions and values from a work perspective: leadership, culture, diversity and inclusion, developing a really strong brand. And again, that helps both at a personal level as well as obviously professionally.
Right. Fantastic. If people want to know more about you or your work, where can they connect with you, Victoria?
I have a individual website, which is victoria-pelletier.com, and your audience can then connect out with whatever preferred social platforms directly out of there, whether it's LinkedIn, Insta, Facebook, etc.
Good. Wonderful. I just celebrate all that you're doing. I mean, you have really made a big difference. And before we got together, I watched a couple of your videos and, you have such great energy. So thank you. Thanks so much for being here today, for making the time. And I just can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much. I love being here.
Okay.